We're going to continue with our discussions of Olduvai Gorge, and particularly Australopithecus boisei. And I wanted to show you a little more detail the arrangement of these chewing muscles that I've been talking about. On the left, you see a human. On the right is Australopithecus boisei, or Zinjanthropus, or as it's sometimes called, Olduvai hominid 5, since it was the fifth piece of a hominin found at Olduvai, and what a piece. So on the left, you've got a human with a large cranial capacity, right, about 6 cups of coffee, 1,400 cubic centimeters. And you've got Zinj on the right that's got about 2¼ cups of coffee inside that brain case in terms of size, 530. So you're starting with a much smaller brain case and much larger muscles than we have in humans. In fact, on the side of your cranium is this muscle, which is called the temporalis muscle. Now you can move your jaw up and down, and you can feel where you no longer can feel that muscle, and it's right about there. It doesn't even come up to the top, okay? But in these huge, robust Australopithecus, called Australopithecus boisei, those muscles are so huge that they reach to the top and beyond and attach to the sides of that crest that runs down the middle. It's called a sagittal crest because this is the sagittal plane of the body. And that comes off the side of the skull, goes down through the zygomatic arch and that temporal fossa, and inserts along the front of this portion of the mandible, just in here, okay? Look how puny our muscle is compared to boisei. The other chewing muscle, remember, clench your teeth, the masseter, M-A-S-S-E-T-E-R, is very small in ours. It starts on the arch and comes back to the angle of the mandible. And you can feel it, probably see it. Whereas in Australopithecus boisei, it comes off of that very large zygomatic arch that's heavily buttressed, deep, and strongly built, and is a massive muscle. So that is the original Cuisinart of human evolution, the one that's just crushing and grinding and built to exert amazing amounts of force. So it's mostly interpreted as a vegetarian, and probably one of the great sources of food might have been roots and tubers, subterranean things like carrots, radishes that you see here, but different sorts of African vegetation. And in fact, at Swartkrans, think back to South Africa, where you have A. robustus, there are pieces of bone that are polished. The tips of these bones are flat bones and they're polished. And people have done experimental archaeology with bones like that, digging up tubers. And it matches the same wear. Maybe they were using things like bones to dig up these roots and tubers, or sticks that don't even preserve. Okay, what's this guy look like? Well, here's a wonderful reconstruction done by, I can read is Raoul, I think it is, Raoul Martin. And what this artist has done is he studied a lot of anatomy. You can dissect humans and apes and see where these muscles arise and where they insert and so forth and so on. So you start with the skull, that mandible that's on there, I'm going to talk about in a minute, that's from another site, but that's what Zinjanthropus or boisei would look like. And then you start putting on the muscles. See the massive, massive masseter muscle he's put there, and the large temporalis muscle right in there. And then he starts to add a little skin and soft tissue like the ears, and you have a massive face where those cheekbones are so big that they move forward, and you can see how dominant those cheeks are. And that is, as I said, one of the ultimate food processing machines in our hominin past. There are other sites in East Africa now where boisei has been well documented. Just adjacent to Olduvai, not far, a little bit further north, near a place called Lake Natron, they found a massive mandible, which I'll show you, that is undoubtedly boisei. Around Lake Turkana, they found many fossils, Richard Leakey's team, and in the Omo and in southwestern Ethiopia at a place called Kanzo. There are good A. boisei remains. Now that is a massive mandible. That's 2.5 inches or 5 centimeter scale. So look at the thickness of that jaw. The thickness of that jaw from there to there is about equivalent to 3.5 or so centimeters. That's a thick jaw. Ours are about that thick. Very deep. It's a occlusal view and a lateral view. And here you can see very clearly, I talked about earlier, when teeth get worn down and the enamel gets worn off, you begin to see these dentine exposures, like there and there. That's the softer dentine under that enamel cap. So this was a very successful creature that seems to have lived for quite a while because of the tooth wear, but it wore off the enamel on those molars and premolars so that the dentine is showing through. So if you take that mandible and you put the zinge face and brain case on top of it, this is more or less what boisei would have looked like. In the Lake Turkana region, we call this area the Circum-Turkana Basin because you have this Rift Valley Lake, classic Rift Valley Lake that used to be called Lake Rudolph after the Archduke of Austria, renamed, fortunately, after the local people, the Turkana people, Lake Turkana. This is the border between Ethiopia and Kenya. The Omo River comes down off the Ethiopian highlands and provides about 90% of the water that goes into Lake Turkana. And there are stratigraphic columns. You remember when we were talking about Hadar, we looked at a geological column. And these are colored with similar colors at similar levels. So you can correlate throughout the basin based on the geology and the dating and so on. And this became one of the most important field laboratories anywhere in Africa. You have very good argon dating, you have very good geological exposures, you have great correlation between sites, and you have sites that are rich in fossils of all kinds of mammals, including our own. The first place I worked in Africa in 1970 was just here, in the Omo River Basin in southern Ethiopia. Today, that region, if you fly over, it's quite spectacular. You'll see a major river, huge river, which is meandering through a very low-grade, flat kind of plain. If you fly across the United States or other rivers around the world, where the river gets fairly flat, you'll see that it begins to meander. That's what that's called. And it's massive. It's flanked by tropical rainforests. And that river goes back millions and millions of years in the Proto-Omo River and brought sediments into the Paleo Lake Turkana. And unfortunately, the deposits in the Omo region, which are actually known as the Shungura Formation after a local village, are mostly laid down by a river, as opposed to a lake like Olduvai or a lake like Hadar and a number of the other sites. And what's troublesome about that is, as you well know, if you throw something into a river, it's swept away and washed downstream. And if an animal falls into a river, begins to decay, the bones sink to the bottom, the skeleton disarticulates, the bones get rolled and broken and scattered. So you don't find many complete specimens, like the skeletons that we found, a skeleton we found like Lucy at Hadar, or some of the material from Malapa that have been found, or other things that we'll be looking at. So, but Omo was very, very important. I call it the magic ruler because it has about 600 meters of sediment. And that 600 meters samples a slice of time between 4 million years ago and about 1.5 million years ago. And you see it exposed on the right. It's not an easy picture to read, but what it is you had the sediments laid down, more or less like that, And then what happened was they were tilted up and eroded off. So you have all of these little cuestas that run like that. And as you fly from east to west, you go from older sediments, which have been brought up, to younger sediments. So it's an incredibly interesting and important place, but it wasn't very rewarding in terms of fossils. But what is most exciting about it for me is that it was the summer, June of 1970, long time ago, when my professor, Professor Clark Howell, pictured here, invited me to come with him to Africa, to the site, and to spend my first summer working at one of these paleoanthropological sites. And learning the geology from the late Jean de Heinzelin, a Belgian geologist who was just encyclopedic. And with the long sideburns, that's me in the upper right-hand corner, learning how to do field work beginning in the Omo in 1970. So most of the fossils, what's the hardest substance in the body, right? Remember? Teeth. So if a mandible is sinking to the bottom of the river and gets rolled, the bone breaks up and goes away, and the teeth sort almost like sorting gravel. So there were lots of isolated individual teeth from older to younger, but unless they were really mega teeth or teeth with meaning very large teeth that you could call a Boisei, or some teeth that were very diagnostic, it was hard to know what species they belonged to. But one gigantic mandible was found, Omo 7A. This mandible, look at that. It's distorted, of course, and filled with cracks, but that right there is about that deep. Look how deep mine is, about that deep. So this was a massive A. boisei from the Omo. At about the same time that two teams, an American team under the direction of Clark Howell, my professor, and a French team under the direction of originally Arenbourg and then subsequently Yves Coppens, there was an American and French team working in the Omo, but on the eastern side of Lake Turkana, in an area known as Kubifora, Richard Leakey, the son of Mary and Louis Leakey, and his colleague Glyn Isaac, they had both worked together at Lake Natron, where that big mandible was found at Peninge, and they decided to systematically scout the eastern side of Lake Turkana under the Kubifora Research Project. And they found lots of examples of A. boisei. They found KNMER, that's Kenya National Museum's East Rudolph, because it was called Lake Rudolph then, a male skull, not as massive as Zinj, a little bit different, maybe geographical variation. And then they found female examples. You notice the females don't have crests. This 406, the male, has a sagittal crest, the female didn't. Variations on the same theme that allows you to look at sexual dimorphism. Well, in 1985, a fascinating skull was found at Lake Turkana on the west side, when it was called Turkana. Kenya National Museum's West Turkana, 17,000. That was the number given to it. And it was called the black skull because it's stained black from minerals. It was found by the National Museums of Kenya by Alan Walker, one of the great anatomists, and it dates from 2.5 million years old. And it is referred to a new species, Ethiopicus, as you can see, which means the southern ape from Ethiopia. We're stuck with Australopithecus, remember? So this really caught my attention as well as it did a number of my colleagues. What was it? Was it a boisei? Some people called it a boisei, Australopithecus boisei. But look at the face. It's not that dish-shaped, flattened face. It's a very projecting face. It had a massive, massive sagittal crest, okay? And it, in reconstruction, here's another one of those wonderful reconstructions by Raoul Martin, showing what Ethiopicus might have looked like, massive face, but very projecting face, unlike Olduvai hominid 5 or Zinjanthropus. So we wrote a very long paper on this discovery, which you see, which was published subsequently. And what I'm going to close with is a very interesting observation. You've got Zinjanthropus up here, right? With a flat face, not projecting, with a sagittal crest, okay, massive teeth. You've got Afarensis, Lucy's species here, we've seen this cranium, with a very projecting face, no sagittal crest, and moderately sized teeth. And in the middle, you have the black skull, or 17,000. And what you have in that is a massive crest, right? But an Afarensis-like face. And what this is an evolutionary, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, a lineage with Afarensis being an ancestor for 17,000, which is called Aethiopicus, that evolved into Zinj, or Australopithecus boisei. And you see the same thing when you look at the skull from the top down. Afarensis has a projecting face, 17,000 has a projecting face, Zinj has a very flat face, and what we're looking at is an evolutionary progression from a more generalized to a more specialized kind of hominin called Australopithecus boisei. So you have Afarensis at 3 million, you have the black skull at 2.5, and you have boisei at 1.82 million years ago. It's a beautiful example of a lineage and how that lineage changed over time. I hope you've enjoyed this East Africa tour.